Welcome to the 10th JEEA-FBBVA lecture, also known as the European Economic Association lecture. Actually, before introducing today's speaker, I just wanted to give a few words about the general nature of this lecture. First of all, I would like to thank the Fondazione BBVA for making this series of lectures possible. Since 2004, the BBVA Foundation, together with the Journal of the European Economic Association, has agreed to organize an annual lecture by a world-class economist on a relevant topic. The very first lecture in 2005 was delivered by this year's Nobel Prize winner, Jean Tirole, so no pressure, Eliana. And a list of past speakers also include Daron Acemoglu and Alberto Resina, Ernst Fehr, Richard Blundell, and Jordi Galli, and many others that are I'm not going to mention. So it's been a very successful series, and we hope that it continues this year as well. I also like the opportunity to say a few words about the Journal of the European Economic Association. When JEEA was launched in 2003, its declared goal was to join the club of the traditional top 5 economics journals and become a top 6 general interest economic journals. And after several years of steady growth, in 2003, JEEA's impact factor reached a record level of 3.36, which puts it on sort of a similar category as the other top 5 journals, and actually higher impact factors than 2 of the other top 5. So it's always dangerous to proclaim mission accomplished, and I'm not going to do that. I think that it could be a one-year blip. But certainly the signs are positive. JEEA is on the map. The number of contributions, of submissions has increased dramatically in the last couple of years. It has almost doubled between 2008 and 2013. Has become even higher in 2014, even though we don't have the exact numbers. The bad news is that the acceptance rate has become quite low, so fewer than 5% of papers are accepted. But at the same time, JEEA prides itself with a very efficient editorial process. The average turnaround time for papers is about 50 days. Just the fact that we measure things in days and not in weeks or months is, I think, a good sign. And it's 70 days if we exclude papers that are summarily rejected. So I'd like to thank in particular the outgoing managing editor, which is Fabrizio Ziribotti, who did a great work in the last 3 years. Also all the past and current editors who have done a great job to maintain the high standards of papers published, and of course all the community of scholars that have chosen JEEA as an outlet to publish their research. And I also take this opportunity to thank Juuso Välimäki, who is the new managing editor, and I wish him the best of luck and hope that he will be able to maintain these standards in the future. So the bottom line is that publishing a paper in JEEA today is a great investment to promote your research and career, and I encourage all of you to submit your best work to JEEA and to spread the word. So now let me spend a few minutes to introduce today's speaker, Professor Eliana La Ferrara from Bocconi University, who is one of the leading voices today in development economics and political economics. Eliana La Ferrara completed a laurea in economics and social sciences at Bocconi University, a dottorato in political economy in 1997, also at Bocconi, and a PhD in economics at Harvard University in 1999. She has a distinguished list of fellowships, visiting appointments, and editorial positions, which I'm not going to list here, but anybody who knows her personally is not surprised because Eliana is a wonderful person and also a wonderful citizen to the community. She's a creative and original researcher whose works have been published in all the leading general interest and field journals in the discipline, and her work has been highly influential, garnering more than 6,000 citations on Google Scholars, with 3 articles with more than 1,000 citations and several others with more than 100. I would say that her most well-known is her work, her seminal work on trust and participation in social activities and economic outcomes, both in the US and developing countries. And I think that her work has been not only influential, but also is a precursor to many of the issues that are a center of the economic and policy debate today, especially with respect to inequality and social mobility. So if I had to describe it in a world, we know that we live in a world with incomplete contracts, and economic outcomes are to a large extent influenced by the degree of trust and social capital in a society. And this is something that economists have started to recognize in the last 20 to 25 years. And Eliana's work has been sort of deeply influential in this area of research. And her most important contribution has been the study of the factors that affect the degree of trust and social participation in society at both the individual and the community level. And particularly noteworthy is her finding that high income inequality seems to be negatively correlated with trust and participation in social activities. And of course, given the centrality of inequality in the public debate today, we could all understand how important this insight is. I hear there was a well-attended session earlier today on inequality, so nobody's surprised that this is really quite important. I'm a big fan of her work on preferences for redistribution and inequality, and especially how preferences for redistribution are shaped by one's beliefs about future mobility. But Eliana is not, this is not her only area of research. She has also done fascinating and original work on conflict and how it affects individual investors. Her work on the illegal arms trade and the returns to diamond mining companies in Angola point to the striking, or maybe not so striking, and certainly sad conclusion that sometimes private investors actually benefit quite a lot from continuing conflict. And I would say that her most recent area of research is in the growing field of media economics. And Eliana has found that TV does not necessarily rot your brain, but may actually have an important positive consequences for the empowerment of women, especially in developing countries. But I really shouldn't expand on that. I think Eliana is guaranteed to do a much better job on explaining how TV can fight poverty. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Eliana La Ferrara from Bocconi University, who will talk about mass media and social change. Can we use television to fight poverty? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele, for your overly generous introduction. For full disclosure, I should say that we were in grad school together, so everything you said about wonderful person and the like, please heavily discount it, but it's reciprocal if I ever get to make that introduction in the future. And I also want to thank you, the Foundation and the European Economic Association, for giving me the chance to discuss this topic with you today. So I just want to start by showing you this descriptive pattern of statistics on TV ownership in a set of sub-Saharan African countries. What you see here is the fraction of households that owned at least one television set. And this fraction starts in the 90s at about 5 to 10% on average. And if you look 20 years later, in 2010, the average would be more around 35–40%. So the growth in TV ownership in these poor economies basically is in the order of 4 or 5-fold in some of the countries. Now contrast this to the evolution of educational achievement in the same countries. In this other panel, you see the fraction of women with secondary education, which also has a rising trend over the same period, but you see the slope of the trend is a lot lower. In fact, the growth in this fraction might be characterized as moving with a factor of 2 or so. So with these two facts in mind, today's lecture wants to try and answer the question of whether, given this rapid spread of television in poor countries, we can actually exploit the television viewership to use it for development policy. Now, the questions that we really aim at when we address this is, first of all, whether it works. So is it effective in transmitting development messages? And also, what is it affecting in addressing? For example, can it change beliefs? Can it change preferences? Can it change behavior? after finding whether it changes stuff or not, we need to understand how it does it and why such changes occur. So what is the role of individual decision per se, and how do these individual decisions depend on the external environment and on social constraints around the individual? And finally, do we know enough about whether the change that we might induce is persisting or short-lived? So what I'll do is I'll just start by overviewing what was the historically initial development in this field, which would be taking stock of TV programs that were not designed with development purposes in mind, so commercial television, and learning what these TV programs did to socioeconomic outcomes. So this is basically a literature that uses historical or contemporary case studies with rigorous methodology, but to learn about television. And I'd like to devote a bit more space instead to the second part, which is where we adopt a more hands-on approach and say, can we change TV programs and deliberately put some educational messages in them to provoke social change? Now here, I'll give you some very brief theoretical underpinnings for acting through these media, borrowed from the social psychology literature, then discuss a few very recent experimental studies that have tried to understand whether educational entertainment works, and finally conclude with some open questions and challenges that we will need to face if we want to really invest in this as a policy tool. Okay? So if you think about television and commercial television in general, it's pretty obvious to us that we might expect effects. First of all, because of information transmission. So when you watch a TV program, you see people who work certain jobs or live in certain environments, and then you might learn that there are certain work opportunities or characteristics through what you see on TV. But it can also affect preferences or aspirations. So I see a character that through a certain jobs becomes successful and fulfilled, then I'm more likely to say, oh, maybe I should consider investing or taking that job. Finally, television will affect socioeconomic outcomes through time use. When I sit in front of TV, I'm not doing something else. Hence, I can expect impacts just through this channel, regardless of what TV content is. Okay? So if you take DHS data, so this is a widely available household level survey, the demographic and health survey indeed, and you take the same sample of sub-Saharan African countries that I showed you in the beginning and correlate the TV ownership rate with a bunch of socioeconomic indicators, you find a pretty stable pattern of positive correlations. So for example, people who own a television are more likely to have been tested for HIV and knowing where to go to get tested. They know that there are drugs to avoid transmission of HIV from mother to child during pregnancies. They have preferences for lower fertility, and also men have preferences for lower fertility, and they're more likely to have progressive value. For example, in societies where domestic violence is widely accepted, you find fewer women saying that a husband is justified in beating them. But clearly, there's very little we can, we can conclude from that set of correlation because TV ownership is endogenous. So maybe the more, outward-looking and progressively minded households are the ones that own television. So the literature in this area has typically used a couple of identification strategies to get at the causal impact of television on outcomes. One strategy, which is common, for example, to other political economy papers of people working on accountability, is to use staggered entry of TV networks across media markets. So here, what you would exploit is the fact that certain areas got access to television earlier and others got it later. And then you compare the rate of socioeconomic change across areas. Of course, you need to make sure that there was no selection in the decision to enter certain markets based on the outcome that you're trying to study. Another set of papers has used a different strategy, which relies on geography and on constraints to signal transmission. So, for example, you can have that TV signal power doesn't reach certain areas because of the configuration of the terrain, and this would be an exogenous determinant of whether households are able to watch TV or not. Okay? So what I'll try to do is to discuss with you very briefly how certain pieces of evidence have been obtained by using these strategies, what have we learned up to now on this, and what we haven't been able to learn yet. So I'll start from a paper that I did with two co-authors, Alberto Chong and Suzanne Durea, which looks at fertility in Brazil. So Brazil is a country that experienced a dramatic drop in fertility starting in the 70s. So if you look at the total fertility rate in the 60s or 70s, it's about 6 children per woman. And in the space of 20 years, so already by 1991, total fertility rate went down to less than 3 children per woman. So this is a dramatic change. Now, this is also a country where the government was never interested in population control, so the change was demand-driven. And what we've tried to do in this paper is to take up an insight coming from anthropologists who had gone as far as the Amazons to study people's reaction to television programs and ask whether exposure to small families in Brazilian telenovelas might be responsible for at least part of the fertility decline. Now, this is a bit of a special case because Brazilian soap operas are really a hugely popular genre, and viewership cuts across social classes. So every Brazilian, professors, PhD students will be very familiar with the soap opera content. And also it has a history of high quality, which goes back to the military dictatorship where intellectuals were not able to publish books with their ideas and started working for the television industry to basically spread progressive messages. So what we did in our work, we analyzed soap operas produced by Rede Globo, which is the monopolist of novelas in Brazil. And what we found was that without any explicit motive for fertility control, these soap operas were portraying women without children or with at most one child. Okay? So the reason was that there were so many families in the plot that if everybody had multiple children, things would get out of control. So what you see there is the fraction of main characters, female characters, who have 0, 1, 2, 3 children. And these are the years, remember, 1980s, 1990s. So I told you the fertility rate went down from 6 to 3, but in these novelas, basically 70% of young women have 0 children and 20% have 1. So people were seeing a completely different family model. They were also seeing very emancipated women. Few of them were married. About 10% were divorced. And 1/3 of the character was unfaithful to the partners. Okay? So how did this content affect viewers' reaction? To answer this question, we exploited the fact that Rede Globo entered different municipalities at different points in time. And we estimated the likelihood of giving birth in a given year as a function of whether the previous year the municipality was covered by the Globo signal or not. Okay? So what you see in this table is the main result, which basically tells you that out of a baseline probability of giving birth of 9% in any given year, women living in cities or municipalities with access to novelas had a 0.5 percentage point lower probability. So in terms of the size, this is equivalent of giving women 1.6 more years of education. So it's quite a sizable effect. And if you look at heterogeneous effects, this is actually stronger for less educated and poorer women. And it makes a lot of sense because when we think of television as a tool for spreading models, the people who are less literate or less, of lower socioeconomic status might be the one that more promptly react to what they see on the screen. If you look at the timing, indeed, every year before the introduction of Globo, so every point to the left of the 0, you don't find any effect. The coefficient on coverage is not significantly different from 0, while starting from the following year, the coefficient becomes negative and significant. So there seems to be indeed a causal impact of viewing the novella. And what we like is that we are able to, at least to some extent, say that it was not just time use, but it was also the content of the program. Why? For example, if you look at the names that people give to their children. So we coded the first name of the main character in every year, and then we look at the names of people born in that year. In particular, what were the most common 20 names in a municipality. And we found that the likelihood that the name of the characters appears in the top 20 list is 25 percentage points higher in municipalities with the signal. So these are very awkward names sometimes, and it is indeed at least an indication that households were taking one of the important decisions, how to name their children, with these role models in mind. More importantly, if you think of content also in terms of aspirations, you can see that there were some years where the novellas were portraying stories of upward social mobility. So very successful women going from, being a slave or being a very poor woman to a successful career. And also the age of the woman was varying a lot. Some characters are 20, 25, others are 45 or 50. So we asked, do we find differential impact depending on content in this respect? And what we found is that in years when there was upward social mobility, the effect on births was more pronounced. So women seemed, or families, as far as we know, seemed to react more to what they were seeing on TV, possibly because they wanted to emulate. And also, the closer was the character to the woman herself, the stronger the effect of fertility. Why? Because you typically identify more with someone who's close to you in age. Now, the next thing that you can ask is, okay, is this Brazil? Is this just this very particular type of novella or not? There's another study by Jensen and Oster that looked at India and that looked at cable television. So these are, programs that we see on our TV every day. And the particular thing here is that when you get access to cable TV, you are exposed to a very different way of life and to the outside world. And so what they do is they exploit a 3-year panel to look at changes in individual attitudes in villages that were covered by cable. So this would be 21 villages in their sample. And they find that, for example, female autonomy increases after you receive cable television. What you see here is an index of decision-making that picks up whether you can have control over money, you have permission to move of your own, and so on. And the 3 bars in each histogram correspond to the years 2001, 2002, 2003. So the part on the left shows you villages that had already cable TV in the first year, 2001. And you can see that here female autonomy is constantly high. If you move to the right, you find villages that got access to cable only in 2002. So there you see that female autonomy was low in 2001, that's the dark shaded bar, and then went up in 2002 as soon as television arrived. And so on and so forth as you move to the right. So basically, there's a suggestive pattern that the entry of cable TV was associated with female autonomy, and they find similar results when they look at domestic violence or preference and education. A more up-to-date exercise in this respect comes from a recent working paper by Kearney and Levin. This working paper looks at a show that you might be familiar with. It's called 16 and Pregnant. And this is a reality show produced by MTV where you see teenagers who get pregnant. So you follow them through the late stages of pregnancies and early stages of motherhood. And it's a bit of a scare what happens there. You know, they show you all the difficulties that these teenagers encounter. So what these two authors did was to basically exploit Nielsen data on ratings of MTV to understand whether market areas that had higher ratings for MTV programs, regardless of 16 and pregnant, were areas where the show had a stronger impact on teenage pregnancies. So here what you see is the number of Google hits and tweets during periods where there was no new episodes, which are the periods without shading in the graph, and during the weeks where new episodes were introduced. And you can see that people were tweeting and searching a lot for 16 and pregnant in those weeks. But very interestingly, when you compare these areas according to the ratings and you look at teenage fertility rates, you find decreases in the order of 3 to 4% in places where the show had a larger viewership. And these decreases are only found among relatively young women, so from 15 to 24. If you look at the group 25 to 29, they are already not receptive to the program. In terms of size, this is quite a significant effect because it corresponds to 1/3 of the decline in teenage pregnancy over this period. And when you look by racial group, something interesting also emerges. So the characters in 16 and pregnant are more or less 50-50 whites and blacks or Hispanic, yet the decrease in teen pregnancies is basically driven by the black non-Hispanic population. And again, we think of television as something that should have the strongest impact, possibly the lower the average socioeconomic status of a group, and this finding seems to confirm that. The last study I want to review in this first batch of studies of commercial TV is a study by Ben Olken that doesn't look at gender outcomes, but rather at social capital. So the reason this study was quite influential is twofold. First of all, that it really focuses on the time use channel as opposed to the content. And in a sense, he's testing Putnam's bowling alone hypothesis. Is it true that when you watch TV, you crowd out social activities like participation in group? But most importantly, Ben came up with quite a clever identification strategy that's been used by many other authors after him, which is basically to exploit geography to proxy for signal reception. So what he did was he used a model of signal propagation developed by Hufford. It's called the irregular terrain model. This model starts from knowing the placement of the transmitter, which would be the antenna on the left in the graph. And then if a location is in a direct line of sight to the transmitter, the signal will be the strongest, while if it's blocked by a mountain, what will happen is that the signal will diffract, and how much it diffracts, it depends on the frequency. So you can build a proxy for how good the signal reception is simply by knowing the location of the transmitters and the geography of the place. So what Olken finds using this strategy is that in places that receive more TV channels, so where people plausibly watch more TV, they participate in fewer groups. So there's about a 7% decline in the number of groups they are a member of. And also the diversity of the groups goes down. And this is a concern because we think in informal economies of group participation as a form of mutual insurance against income shocks. And in fact, if you look at the breakdown of the groups where they participate, you see that religious groups in the middle there are not affected, while what goes down is attendance in non-religious groups. And ROSCAs, which are these rotating savings and credit association, that indeed serve a very important function in terms of credit access and insurance. So we can use this strategy and go back to the initial correlations that I showed you. So take the DHS data and see if you know the antenna placement and you want to see how signal reception affects those outcomes, what you get. So here you see a map of Nigeria. The dots are the location of the antennas of the NTA, the main national television, and darker areas correspond to areas that have a better signal reception. Now, when you re-estimate those regressions for Nigeria using this more exogenous regression, you find a pretty consistent picture with what we found below. So again, it seems to be that television access did affect socioeconomic outcomes in a positive direction. So what do we learn from these studies? One thing we certainly learn is that these TV programs have affected attitudes and behaviors, and also that they do have some crowding out effects in terms of time use with social activities. However, this does not necessarily take us very far in terms of policy. In particular, when you want to think of using these programs for development, you want to be able to design the content so that you can maximize the desired impact and you can minimize the cost. So this is what I want to do now in the next part of the talk, that is to discuss what's called as edutainment, or educational entertainment, and start from the theory to understand why indeed we expect this type of policy to work. So edutainment means having programs that strategically employ the media to show role models that promote socially desirable behaviors and dissuade undesirable ones. Okay? Historically, this movement, if you want to call it, started or as early as the late 60s with a Peruvian telenovela called Simplemente Maria. So this was about a housemaid who started to sue. And what happened at the time was that low socioeconomic status women suddenly decided to enroll in suing classes and adult literacy classes. So they were asking for permission to the households where they were working to leave at night and take these classes. And it was such a massive social effect that the Peruvian government launched a public literacy program specifically for housemaids. Now, following this, many Latin American countries decided to take on this telenovela genre and try to promote positive messages. In so doing, they were inspired by a very famous psychologist called Albert Bandura, whose contribution span, a lot of areas, but one of the things he's best known for is the social learning theory. So Bandura theorized that individuals certainly learn through direct experience, but they also learn through experience of others. And when you think about the media, this is powerful. Why? Because in the media, you can exploit the fact that you view a character who makes mistakes, but you don't bear the costs of making those mistakes. So you can depict role models from which you learn at no personal cost. The other concept that Bandura developed and that was crucial for the edutainment movement was that of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy means that you believe you have the capabilities to organize and execute the actions that are needed for you in prospective situations in the future. Now, again, people might not know or believe that they have this power or these capabilities, but the media can show very similar individuals to you, so they can present individuals with characteristics that are on purpose made similar to their target audience who succeed in reaching certain objectives. So in this way, you induce the viewers to consider this goal as feasible and you increase their motivation to act. Now, people took Bandura's concepts and applied them in media production. One of the first pioneers was Miguel Sabido, who worked for the Mexican TV network Televisa, and in the 70s produced many edutainment telenovelas. So the building blocks in his production and in edutainment in general were the following. First of all, you need to be very careful about role modeling in these programs. Typically, you will find that there are always three types of characters. One is the positive character, then the negative, and the transitional. Now, positive and negative are very easy. They basically embed what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. But the transitional characters are where the skills of the producer go. So these are characters that move from doing the wrong thing in the beginning to doing the right one, or vice versa. And the reason these are the crucial characters is that viewers will typically identify with them. So none of us, sees ourselves as perfect or totally hopeless. And these transitional characters are where you want to put your best hopes of affecting viewers. Now, identification is another key component. So you need to be able to find and portray situations that are similar enough to your target audience. And the balance is a little subtle, because if you make it too similar, you will not achieve change. But if you make it too far, the viewers might detach. And finally, a lot of these edutainment productions have exemplification, in the sense that they really show practically how to deal with problems and where you can find information. So other features include, interaction with the characters. You need to create some emotional bonding. Drama and humor. This is also interesting. You will be surprised if you watch these productions that there's a lot of mixing between laughs and dramatic situation. But this is, again, a way of capturing attention and creating interaction with the characters. There's a lot of repetition of messages, which the duration of novellas and soaps typically makes possible. And also there's a bit of a blur between fantasy and reality. But let's get to, what we as economists have done. We are very latecomers in this literature. And the work we've done so far has been mostly to try and understand whether they worked or not. So as I said, research is lagging behind policy a little bit because NGOs and to a lesser extent governments have already invested in edutainment for some time. And there are huge nonprofits that specialize in this. I listed two there, but there are many more. Now, what's a little puzzling is that the type of evidence that a lot of these existing productions have brought forward is really of the form, we called up a bunch of viewers and there was a positive reaction to the show. Or if you compare attitudes after and before, this is what you find. But there's less evidence that is rigorous in the sense of, econometric standards that we take as a benchmark in economics on the impacts of these types of programs. So what I'll do next is review a few things that we have learned using rigorous methodology and build on very, very recent studies that have tackled this problem seriously. So the first thing we've learned is that if you take an edutainment production, you can certainly use it for providing information. So studies are pretty unanimous on showing that information can successfully be channeled. I will discuss a paper which is a very nice executed evaluation of financial education in South Africa, and this is by Berg and JEEA. This paper is in the context of a financial literacy program. So we all know that making financial decisions can be challenging, especially for low socioeconomic status individuals. And there's been a growing interest in development, but also in industrialized countries on financial literacy programs. What is less clear is how best to convey financial information, and edutainment can help there. So what these two authors did was they teamed up with the producers of a famous soap opera in South Africa. This soap opera is called Scandal, and it's been running for over 8 years. So they agreed to get a space of 2 months to put a subplot about debt in the story. So they developed the subplot with the National Debt Mediation Association, and they decided that what they wanted to address were the very high rates of hire purchase agreements in South African societies. So they show that the main character gets in trouble because she spends too much through these installment plans. And they highlight how these plans basically have high interest costs, high interest charges and hidden costs. They also show how she reacts. So first she starts gambling to try and make money. Things don't go well. And finally, she goes for advice to one of these NDMA officers, and then there she understands how to get out of debt. And at the end of these episodes, they were showing a toll-free number for the National Debt Mediation Association so that people who wanted to call could call. So they did this in a very rigorous way. Basically, they designed a symmetric encouragement design. They took a sample of people from Johannesburg and Pretoria, and one group was randomly selected to receive financial incentives to watch this scandal soap opera, and another group received similar incentives to watch another soap opera in prime time, which was showing exactly at the same time. So what they did was they called them every 3 weeks or so with some quizzes on the content, and if you correctly answered, then you got money. So this way, they can be sure that there is compliance, or at least they maximize chances of compliance, and then they go back and measure financial knowledge and behavior. So the first thing you see is, again, this strategy of showing the toll-free number worked pretty well, because the red line is the day when the toll-free number appeared, and the spike afterwards is the number of calls that the NDMA received shortly after. More importantly for us, they find that people who were invited to watch Scandal had better financial knowledge. Where do they have it? Well, they have it when it comes to specific literacy, which is knowledge of the characteristics of hire purchase agreement. They don't do any better when it comes to general financial literacy, which basically is about separating business and personal finances. It's about probability. It's about writing down budgets. So it's really the soap that improved their knowledge of certain schemes. Behavior also changed. So people who watch Scandal are less likely 6 months later to have used hire purchase, and also less likely to have gambled. What's a little less positive as a message is what happens to seeking advice. So if you go there immediately after the soap was in February and March. So if you ask them in April whether you will seek advice from formal sources, people who watch the soap are more likely to do it. But if you go there 6 months later, so you ask in July, then you no longer find any impact on these intentions. So this is one of the issues that you might have to face, which is you can get very strong impacts immediately, but how long are they going to last? Another example, which I think teaches us the pros and potential limitations of this, is a recent paper by Ravallion, Van de Walle, Dutta and Murgay, and this is about public works in India. Again, it starts from something that we're very familiar with, which is problems of public service delivery in developing countries. Economists have been big fans of information campaigns, and these information campaigns have been delivered in different ways. For example, newspaper reports, scorecards, flyers. Now, again, you can think that in low literacy settings, televisions or movies might work pretty well. So what they did was they decided to tackle pitfalls in the Indian Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. This is India's largest anti-poverty program, and it provides up to 100 days of work to rural households who are eligible in exchange for unskilled manual labor. Now, what happened in India, and especially in some of the poorest places like Bihar, is that you found take-up rates that were a lot lower than was expected. And people have said that it was partly because of corruption, but partly because poor individuals were not aware of the existence and the complexity of the system, that is how you should apply for the program. So they decided to produce a movie. They produced a 25-minute movie where you see a migrant who comes back to the village and needs to find some work. So he is told about the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and he learns that even in the lean season, he can get paid so that he doesn't need to go back to the city, and he can stay with his family. So in this plot, you see intertwined information about how the program works, who is eligible, and how you can participate. So what they then did was they selected a sample of villages, and in a random group of these villages, they went to show this movie, following up about 2 to 4 months later with a survey to measure knowledge of the scheme, perceptions about whether it's good and how it works, and also actual usage. Again, the evidence on knowledge is pretty clear-cut. In the first column there, you see the differential propensity to give the correct answer on a number of characteristics of the scheme in villages where the film was shown. And you see that pretty much everywhere these people knew more about NREGS than other people. You also find surprising effect on perceptions. So for example, people who saw the movie have a higher perception that this scheme increased employment, that it decreased migration, and also that the work opportunities of family members improved over the last year. They also have some surprising bad reactions. For example, they are less likely to think that women can participate. And this, again, shows one of the dangers of using these programs. Why? Because in 25 minutes, you could not employ everybody into the scheme, so they chose a male character. And even though at some point it was said that women can apply, viewers kept seeing these men working. And this unintentionally created a perception that women would be less likely to be employed. Why do I see that the overall positive effects on perceptions are surprising? Because when you look at actual outcomes, the impact was zero everywhere. So there was no more participation in the program, not in terms of extensive nor intensive margin. Wages didn't change, and desired participation for the future also did not change, okay? So if what we care are hard outcomes, we would say that the movie was not effective. Now again, what the authors of the paper say is that the problem was not with the movie, was with supply-side constraints. So, the infrastructure did not match the needs created by the movie. I think another issue that has not been highlighted in the literature and that I consider important is that this movie, but also other interventions, might shift individual beliefs, but might not be capable of changing behavior in situations where there are strategic interdependencies. So, for example, I could think that, I have the right to go and ask to work, but if I'm not sure about how other people will react to the movie or what they will do, I may decide not to act on it. So, in general, I think one issue that needs to be addressed a lot more carefully than what we've done so far is this issue of what the rest of the viewers or the community do. To some extent, this has started to be discussed, for example, in social psychology, and there is limited evidence that you can use educational entertainment to change at least perceived social norms. So Betsy Paluk, who's a social psychologist, has been working for a long time in Rwanda on issues of prejudice reduction. And what her research is about is, can we use educational entertainment to change deeply rooted stereotypes and norms of intergroup cooperation? She produced radio soap operas designed to address mistrust and lack of communication in the post-genocide Rwanda. And what she did was she organized groups of people listening to these soaps with repeated visits of about, a year at monthly frequency. So she selected 14 communities, and in half of them, she had enumerators go there with a radio soap opera, which was about reconciliation. And in the other half of the communities, there was a placebo or control radio soap, which was on reproductive health and HIV. Here, the focus is on beliefs, but especially on social norms, where social norms are divided into those that tell you what other people do, that would be the descriptive norm, but also those that tell you how other people should behave, that would be the prescriptive norms. So, interestingly, Paluk finds no effect on belief. So while the Ravalion paper had only effects on beliefs, she finds the opposite. The origin of violence and what happens to people who are bystanders in violence doesn't seem to be affected by listening to this educational soap. You can see the p-values on this last column. While the impact on perceived norms is pretty strong. So after listening to the radio, people are more likely to say that intermarriage should be allowed, that you should trust, you should be able to dissent, and you should be willing to talk about trauma. For example, if you look at descriptive instead of prescriptive norms, she also finds no effect. So although you should trust more, when you're asked, is there trust or not around you, the soap doesn't change that. And I think this is another instance of where you might think individually that the soap has given you a certain message, but you're not sure about what other people have received. So the last part of what I want to do is to try and put these pieces together and say, can we design a product where individual beliefs, social norms, and behavior are carefully manipulated so as to achieve the desired effects. And to do this, I'll do something very brave and maybe a little irresponsible, which is discuss something that's not even a working paper, is literally in the field now. But it's something I'm very excited about, so I wanted to tell you a bit about it. It's work with Abhijit Banerjee and Victor Orozco in southern Nigeria, and it's an educational program about HIV and domestic violence prevention. So, oops, sorry. So what we did was to team up with a professional, which is MTV, and design and evaluate a series whose goal is to reduce risky sexual behavior and gender-based violence. So this series is called Suga. MTV has produced it already for 2 seasons. The first 2 seasons were in Kenya, and the third is in Nigeria. So Suga is about young people who like to hang out in clubs. They have a very hip lifestyle. They have many partners, so they enjoy life in that dimension. And the theme of Suga 3 is that they keep a lot of secrets from each other. So some secrets is that they're being unfaithful. Other secrets are that they are, for example, HIV positive and they don't tell their partner. So what the series does is to show you the consequences of behavior, but also of keeping these secrets. And it does it in a way that, sort of subtly conveys the information you need to get and also, suggestions on how to act. So because it's soap opera time, I want to try and show you a clip. And this clip should, in principle, make you see how those elements of construction of the product that I described before fit into place. So you're going to see one of the main characters, Sophie, who finds out that her sugar daddy is taking antiretroviral drugs. So she understands that he's HIV positive. And then she goes to get tested together with another man with whom she slept. When she goes to get tested, you will see that there is, a simple way of showing what happens to you if you go and get tested. And you'll also see that, the nurse gives some advice on what she should do next. One last thing you might want to notice, you will see that in the clip, the characters mix English with traditional proverbs. And again, that is one way of making the viewer identify with the character, but also the proverbs are used by a negative character, which is the sugar daddy. So it's a very subliminal message that tradition might not get you in the right direction. So I'll give you to this, if it works, 3 minutes of clip, and then we resume.
Hey, what are you doing? That's expensive,
We didn't use a condom last night again.
It's not the same, baby. It's not the same.
Same. I have a lecture to be getting. So
don't go.
Solo, I thought you said you're too good for Viagra.
What? What do you think you're doing? Hey, you're too pretty. Next time, just ask for the money, okay?
Okay.
Is that you asking for a favor?
I beg. What's this, Viagra, right?
Viagra, no. ARVs. ARVs.
Antiretroviral drug.
Yeah.
The ones for HIV.
Do these belong to someone you know? One of your runs?
Have you had intercourse in the past 3 months without the use of condoms?
Has your partner undergone testing?
The virus can take 3 months to appear. It's what we call the window period. I would like for us to discuss ways to avoid future risks.
You don't have to tell me twice.
Does if I ever have sex again, sir?
Okay, so that's the end. As you saw, there's a little bit of serious and non-serious stuff in the production. And ideally, what you would like to be able to do is to evaluate this on the population that's watching the series on TV. To date, this has not proven to be very easy, because basically you don't want to rely on individual choices to watch or not to watch. So what we decided to do for the evaluation is to screen the soap opera ourselves. So we gathered young people in screening centers that could be community centers or schools, and then in some of these centers we showed Suga, and in others we showed a placebo soap opera that had a very similar setting, again with fancy lifestyle, but no educational content whatsoever. So these would be the screening centers that we had. We did it in urban areas because the message would be probably more acceptable there compared to rural areas. There's a lot of promiscuity in the soap as well. And the research questions we wanted to tackle were the following. First of all, can a program like this work to affect risky sexual behavior and domestic violence? Most importantly, can we learn through what channels it works? So, for example, is it purely because of information on the consequences of these behaviors? Is it changing the beliefs on what should be done? Is it changing the beliefs on what other people will do? And this is for the coordination problems I mentioned before. We also want to capture spillover effects through the network of friends who did not watch the soap opera. And this is pretty important if you think about the cost effectiveness of these types of interventions. So our evaluation design had several arms. In one arm, we just showed the movie. So this will be the simplest impact evaluation. In a second arm, we complemented the movie with announcements on what other people thought after watching the soap. So basically, people gathered at multiple times to see the different episodes. And in a pilot exercise, we collected questionnaires from people who had already seen the soap on what they thought about attitudes towards HIV, domestic violence, and the like. Then with these answers, we compiled descriptive statistics in the form of smart graphs that we showed to the treated individuals in our real intervention. So after the movie, we basically showed a short video with interviews to the young people like them, and also with information on how they reacted. One of the screens would look like this. We would say, we showed Suga to people like you in nearby communities, and out of 100 people who watched it, 66 thought that if you had HIV, you should tell your partner. 14 said maybe you should tell, and 20 said you shouldn't tell. Okay? Now, note what we wanted to achieve with this was to give a focal point to the viewers to anchor their beliefs on how the others would react. But notice that these numbers that we're showing might constitute a positive or a negative signal depending on the ex ante belief that the individual had. So if someone thought that 90% of the people would tell their partner, now what we've shown is actually going in the wrong direction. It's telling them that it's not as good to tell your partner. On the opposite, if they thought 20% would tell, this is a positive shock. Now, we'll be able to test whether the effect goes in one direction or the other because we have elicited the individual beliefs of the individuals in the baseline survey. So we'll try to see whether the movie, when you combine it with a positive or a negative signal about how the community will react, has a differential impact. Now, this virtual community of people around you might not be what you care about. So in a third treatment arm, we allowed people to invite their friends and watch the movie with their friend. So in this case, what could happen is that, the people I really care about will tell me how they react, and at that point, again, I can decide what action to take. And finally, we have the control arm that sees the placebo TV series. So to summarize, in the main treatment arm, we'll be able to say what is the effect of watching Suga, and this will be an average of the effect of people who watch it with friends and not with friends. In the second treatment arm, we will be able to see whether belief updating and behavioral change is different when other community members are supposed to react in a certain direction. And in the final treatment arm, we'll see whether reinforcing the message with friends, discussions, and reactions will affect the impact. So the data we'll have will come from the baseline that we just concluded. And together with the baseline, we fielded the intervention. So after showing these episodes, we already gave people short questionnaires with the same some of the questions that we had in the baseline. So what I'm going to show you today is a first impact evidence that comes from comparing baseline answers with answers that came about 3 weeks to 4 weeks later after they had seen the movie. And then in the follow-up that we will do in the spring, we will test whether the effects are short-lived or long-lived. So the outcomes we want to look at are beliefs, and here we did quite a bit to elicit probabilities of getting HIV and other transmitted diseases, attitudes of the individual themselves, but also of other people. For example, we asked out of 20 people, we asked things like, do you think someone with HIV should be allowed to teach? And then we ask, out of 20 people in this community, how many do you think believe that someone with HIV should be allowed to teach? So these would be the second order beliefs that you care about in a strategic setting. Also, we will measure behavior through self-reported as well as objective indicators like biomarkers, and we elicited beliefs on other people's behavior with the same method. So the last thing I'll do is show you these preliminary impact estimates with two methods. In one, I will compare treated individuals and the control group. So for treated individuals, what I'll be using are the answers that they gave after watching the movie through these short questionnaires. And for the control individuals, I will be using the baseline survey because after watching the placebo movie, there was no sense in asking them questions about HIV, for example. And here I will put center fixed effects. The second method will use a subsample of the data, which is only treated people, and will be comparing their answers in the baseline and after seeing the movie. So again, this will be 3 to 4 weeks apart. And because everything else is supposedly constant in this short time period, we could think of this as causal evidence, although it will not be eventually the main identification strategy in the paper. So here you see some effects on attitudes towards HIV. The mean in the control group is in the first column, and then you see the coefficient on treatment, that is the people who watched Suga as opposed to the placebo. So these people are less likely to say that they would keep it a secret if they had HIV. They're more likely to tell their partner, and they're less likely to think that HIV is a punishment for sleeping around. So one of the stories in the soap was about this young boy who has HIV because he got it from his mother, and he's ostracized from the football team. So if you look at people who say that boys with HIV should be allowed to play football, you find quite a sizable impact of watching the movie, and because we asked it multiple times, you see that this impact gets reinforced the more they see the story. Now, when you compare the estimates using the second method, that is the individual before and after, with individual fixed effects, it's nice that the point estimates are virtually identical, and this is what it should be if you randomize, because you, before the movie, are the same as the control group. Here you see something interesting. We asked about sugar daddy, and we asked about promiscuity. In particular, we asked if unmarried men or unmarried women should only have sex with one partner. The direction of these effects is the opposite of what you would want if you were trying to discourage risky behavior. And why do we think that happened? It's because the plot shows you a lot of people who are very casual and relaxed in sleeping with others. So this is a bit of a danger that I will discuss in the end, because to create a successful product, you may have these unintended effects. Attitudes towards contraception improved in the sense that, again, there is a character who wants to study and not get pregnant and takes contraception without telling her husband. This triggers a greater acceptability of this behavior, and people are less likely to say that if you bring a condom, you lose respect of your partner. And finally, attitudes towards domestic violence also improve. Here, what you see in the story is that people are helped by their friends, not by the families. And in fact, we find that treated people are more likely to say that someone in the family should intervene, and more likely to say less about the family and more about friends. Okay? So let me conclude. What have we learned from this and this we haven't learned yet much, but the other evaluation of educational entertainment. We've learned that they are effective in conveying information. When it comes to behavior and social norms, I would say the results are mixed at best. And it's a bit difficult to understand why, because existing experimental evaluations have not gone beyond the average simple impact. So here I think there's, a potential for more research to help us understand the mechanisms, which would be about disentangling the role of beliefs and social norms, the role of networks in strategic interaction settings, but also I think something that has not been addressed at all is how these new norms that you're trying to convey interact with traditional ones, and how you could design the product to make social change acceptable. So this brings me to the role of content. At least so far, for me, it's been extremely hard to try and convince producers to manipulate content. People think that they know what works and that we don't have many insights that we can give them. I think the results from the evaluation show that maybe they don't know so much what works, or at least that there should be more work in trying to learn how to deliver the message. And so the contrasting results from the different evaluations could be due to the different settings, but it could also be due to the fact that the content was not controlled in a way that would allow us to learn about the messages. Of course, when you think about manipulating content, there are some important caveats which I think should be very clear in our mind. The first is that you can have unintended effects. So try to please the consumer and the viewer might mean that you're weaving messages that are not so good. The promiscuity one was an example, but you can think about other messages. And this is about how the market somehow might dictate unintended effects. But you can think about the government also interfering, because the moment you start saying that you manipulate content for educational purposes, if you are in a low institutionalized setting or low democracy environment, you could see how this might get captured by politicians. And recent work, for example, by Yanagisawa or De La Vigna and others, has shown that there is indeed scope for this political manipulation of media programs. So the last open issue is about duration and time. How long should these programs run for? And how massive should our intervention be in terms of frequency? And this is because people might forget information, but also it takes time to learn. And once you stop it, the old influences might undo what you've done. Again, this is, I think, one part where the non-experimental evaluations have an advantage over the randomized controlled trials that I just discussed. If you think of Brazil or the cable TV, the other papers, these are things that go on for years, and they go on at very high frequency. When you do an RCT, you're very often constrained to design a smaller and more concentrated intervention, and so you don't learn that much about this time dimension. So, I put forward these caveats, but I think, at least in my mind, the overall balance is positive in the sense that I think this is an exciting agenda where we can use the tools of economics, social psychology, and communication and put them to the service of development policy. And I wasn't too explicit about it, but by no means this should be seen as an alternative to more standard development programs. I see it more as a complement as opposed to a substitute. So this is what the complementarity looks like. Okay, so that's it, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was very good, and I wish I had money. I would have taken you direct to Africa, where I come from, 2 days ago with my wife. Come from South Africa, and I watched Scandal. You referred to, that soap, Scandal, and the gentleman in that soap who went, bankrupt is Daniel. Yes, there is, as you said, to be, and we can use TV to get poverty in Africa. I would like to agree one side and to give you some other comment. One side, yes, I would like to agree, because I myself watching Oprah, at the time that Oprah was still running in South Africa, watching Dr. Oz, fighting the diabetes. Dr. Oz helped me a lot in fighting the diabetes, in South Africa, and also watching, Dr. Phil helped me a lot, in business, and that was TV. Okay, that I agree with you that when we use, we can take the TV and use that to elevate. Is where I would like to a little bit disagree, scientifically disagree, with you is that the impact that this TV are presenting in Africa. I come from Africa, from South Africa. I'm from origin, the DRC where my mom still is. When you take the TV, you take the program like the MTV. They are run in English. Now the accessibility of those programs, first financially it is a problem, because that's where I want to come from. Having one TV and being financial capable of accessing those right channels is one thing. And even when you do have the financial muscles for those programs, but the language barrier is also a problem. Let's take sugar in Nigeria. Let's take in South Africa, old generation in South Africa, they are run in English, but the poor of the poor are those ones that cannot speak English. And when you run those programs in English, it's not accessible to those people because they've got that language barrier. Then the impact, because I want to comment more on the impact. The impact to those one that should be transformed is very, very, very small. The people like me who can speak, I used to speak French, now I'm speaking English and French as well. I can have access financially as well as having access to that language which is English. Why that? And in your study, if you need to continue further in your study. Why? Because there is this conflict between those running the program. The program is not run for education purpose. It's run for commercial purpose. You watch Scandal for 30 minutes in South Africa, out of each 16 minutes are commercial. So there is those interruption, and you do not get education when you get interrupted for 30 minutes. You've got 16 minutes that are run for for commercial purpose, for advertisement, things like that. I think, yes, I suspect there is a correlation between having a TV and being educated, but the qualification for that education should be the filter. Having a TV, being financial capable of accessing good program, and not having the language barrier to those programs, then we can have those education. Those are my comments.
Other questions?
Okay. So you have a very valid point, and indeed, the initial motivation was to reach people in low literacy settings, and a program like Suga in English doesn't necessarily do that. So on our side, the reason we decided to go with that is that I wanted to try and have as perfect a professional execution as possible, to say if it doesn't work, it's not because the content was not professionally done. But indeed, the sample that we chose was pre-selected by screening out people who couldn't speak English. So our external validity will be limited in the sense that we're talking about urban areas and people that are not the poorest or the lowest in terms of socioeconomic status. Yet, it is a first attempt to say, does it work there? I don't think this necessarily invalidates the possibility of using it as a tool. So, for example, the radio soap operas are very often done in local languages, and very poor people are much more likely to have a radio than to have a TV. So you can still use it. I think the question is, because TV will be widespread, and you have some national networks as well as private commercial networks, just understanding that you can create such a product, would it make it worthwhile for, let's say, the Ministry of Education to buy some time and have a show? Sesame Street is a very famous example where these educational messages became part of a show that was, broadcasted all over the world. But again, I think there is a tension between, the more financially heavy networks and commercial interruptions and the like, and the educational purpose, but I don't think it's something that necessarily undermines this as a tool. You just need to do it in a way that is appropriate to the target audience you want to reach. But thanks. Okay.
Use my present prerogative to ask one question.
Yes.
So I was wondering, about the first part of the talk, you were giving some examples of, the Brazilian novellas, or India, or 16 and Pregnant. Be Pretty and Marry Something, which is a little bit selective, that it picks sort of the show on the potentially negative effects.
I think you uncovered the development economist / socially minded person bias, which is not a publication bias, but it's indeed programs. I think paper, for example, but ex ante you expect to have an impact. Again, Cohen Shapiro was a situation where on paper you could expect to see a negative effect. They didn't find one. Again, it was not necessary. Education indeed tend to work on positive examples. But I think you're right. There might be a need, again, with the goal of learning to avoid future mistakes, for research on the bad effects in terms of role models and the like. Yeah.
One last question? Yeah, no, please.
I would probably make a distinction between the impact of mass media or television or radio on beliefs and attitudes on one side and social norms on the other, because I think it's much more difficult to have an impact on social norms that are well rooted in the population, and so probably bottom-up approaches are better for social norms, while mass media are more suited for like changing beliefs and attitudes.
So, in a sense, I see your point. I think this change in social norms comes from the aggregation of changes in individual beliefs and attitudes. So what the social norm is in society is the result of many people changing at the same time. A little bit of what we're trying to do with these coordination tricks is to get at that. I think one way in which what you say is really true is that the time frame you need for detecting impact on one or on the other is very different. So you can detect impacts on individual beliefs pretty quickly, but to say that the social norm has shifted, your horizon must be a lot longer. Yet, I would think that it's going to be difficult to change the norm if you haven't changed the beliefs or the attitudes in the first place. So I see the things as interconnected, and I see the aggregation of the individual effects as what will, in the long run, change the social norm. But to be honest, somehow in the very heterogeneous research path that I followed and that Daniele described in the beginning, this issue of what society considers acceptable, desirable, and how social norms change is a bit of a common thread. So I do see this as a tool for, in the long run, changing norms. But you're right that it's probably a bit overambitious to think that a single program might trigger a sustained change per se. But thanks for making the point. Okay.
So thank you very much.